continuation of the theme in multiple senses. One is a very literal one, is that I collaborated a lot with Kelsey in the last year, and some of the work that I'll present will be of a similar fold, the kind of building on the same paradigm. I'm a research scientist at DeepMind. I'm also affiliate faculty at Columbia in the neuroscience department. So I'll talk a little bit about how these themes of relational and predictive reasoning relate to some modeling of neural data we've been working on, as well as some directions for learned simulation that we've been thinking about. Let me first explain why I have this picture of an eclipse. I did something many people did a few weeks ago. I went on a road trip in search of totality with my mom, and we went and saw the eclipse. And at some point during our many, many hours in traffic, we had some time for thinking. And I was thinking about how this trip was really a good example of the many roles that prediction can serve, particularly in the context of deep learning and eclipse hunting. One is that simulation is just straightforwardly useful for planning. In a lot of the decisions that we were making, specific predictions about exactly what time a different area would see totality, what the weather would be at that point in time, what the traffic would be on the way, were informing the actions that we were going to choose. We decided not to head to New York, we went to Vermont, where we thought we'd have a clearer view because of these kind of rollouts simulating what was going to happen and ending up with an unsatisfactory eclipse viewing experience. Another thing that prediction can do, and this was made very clear on our trip, is that it is sufficient to drive rich feature learning. And the version of this that manifested is I learned way more about Vermont than I ever had learned about Vermont or wanted to learn about Vermont. I learned about the geography, the traffic patterns, what cirrus clouds are, and how quickly they roll in from Lake Champlain. All of these things were learned in the service of trying to make predictions about exactly where I would have a good view of totality. This first version relates to the themes that Kelsey talked about, particularly using neural networks to learn good simulators. And this second direction is going to relate to the work that I'll talk about next, how predictive auxiliary objectives are useful for driving feature learning, and some work that we've done recently trying to see if this is a good way to explain some features of neural representations in the brain. This is work that was done in collaboration largely done by Qing Fang. She's a PhD student at Columbia, and she's graduating this year. And this is work that she presented at iClear a few weeks ago. So we're going to start from just a simple reinforcement learning setup. We're going to have rewards, maybe strawberries, a state, maybe you're 1 meter south of a hedge. And in a classic reinforcement learning setup, you're just trying to predict how valuable, on average, how much expected future reward you're going to get from every state in your environment. So these will be the Q values, the expected future reward that's associated with each state in your environment. Now, of course, when we get into the context of DeepRL, we start having the problem of representation learning. So here, instead of learning in a more tabular manner, the expected reward that's associated with each discrete state in your environment, you have observations, you filter them through a neural network, and now you're trying to learn the expected reward over some state representation, over some latent variable Z. And once we have this representation learning problem, that has some advantages for us. We can learn much more appropriate, rich representations of our task, things that really focus on the features we care about. It also introduces some challenges because now it's on us, it's on the network to keep around the features that it needs. This can have some problems associated with it, and auxiliary objectives are one approach for dealing with them. So the basic intuition behind this is that in tabular RL, as illustrated in this figure from Dabney et al., on the far left side, you have a stationary state representation. So it might not fit to exactly the features you want. It might not express meaningful differences, but you won't have to worry about losing features. You'll have all of these states persistently represented over time. In DeepRL, your feature space can move to whatever is best equipped to capture the value function as you currently understand it. So you have this plane rotating up to fit the value vector. And in DeepRL with auxiliary objectives, you basically have different forces pulling this representation around. So you can't strictly overfit to the reward objective. You also have other features that are pulling it to represent other information too. So this is particularly useful in multitask learning environments. If you are overfitting to your current policy, then you might lose features that are relevant to later tasks down the road. It's also useful in sparse reward environments. If your current policy is not a good proxy for the optimal policy you might want, then you could lose a lot of information just doing what you currently think is best before you find reward down the line that changes your mind. So this is really like a challenge in DeepRL, and a lot of the DeepRL methods that have been helpful in the last few years have been ways to like add tricks that avoid representational collapse. So in this context, we wanted to use this perspective to understand how representations in different areas of the brain work together. I'll also mention the previous slide is about auxiliary objectives in general. And one popular choice is predictive or self-supervision as an objective. Basically, if you can predict what's going to happen next, it's one way to force yourself to learn a lot of information. There's limitations to this. It's not always good. You might waste a lot of capacity. Predictions might be noisy. It doesn't solve all of your problems, but it's a popular choice and it helps with some things. The particular objective that we're using, this is not all of the terms in the loss, and I'll get into that in a bit, but this is a good intuition to start with for now. Basically, at a high level, we use a contrastive predictive loss, and one term in that loss is this term here, which is basically saying, try to predict the next latent state, conditional on some action that you've taken. So this is really forcing the latent representation in this model to approach or to have information sufficient to predict what that state will look like on the next time step. Since we're using this to model multi-region computation in the brain, we want to draw some analogies. We're thinking of our encoder as sensory areas, sensory association areas, our model-free Q-learning part as striatal basal ganglia learning, and our predictive auxiliary objective, as what's happening in the hippocampal entorhinal circuit. So we'll look at now some neural representations in these areas, see how well they match what would be predicted by this model. And importantly, because this model is trained end-to-end, the representation, the objectives, the two objectives that are at the bottom of the screen are capable of pulling representations down around in these other areas in the model. So it's really like useful as a model for thinking about how a learning objective in one part of the brain might place representational demands elsewhere in the system. So first, we just kind of want a sanity check. Are we in a regime that this helps a little bit? We're going to start with a really toy environment. It's just a tabular, or it's just a simple grid world. We can see there's not that much room for improvement. A Q-learning agent does fine. It's not a hard task, but the predictive objective helps it get there a little faster. It also helps on transfer learning. If we look at the representations in the latent state, we can see why it's helping. Instead of having this large representational capacity in the reward region, we have a more flat and geometrically appropriate representation that stretches out the grid world in this space. So first, we're going to look at the hippocampal module. And our first kind of sanity check is like, does this recapitulate some of the classic hippocampal results people have been thinking about in the space of hippocampal representations, as well as particularly predictive representations in hippocampus? First, we see that place fields form. And this makes sense because we have these locally smooth, this locally smooth objective that causes spatially receptive fields to form. We also see a predictive skew. So this is that place cells are moving backwards opposite the direction of motion in a linear environment. This is something that's been previously modeled. I had some work on it a while ago, and Xing's had some work before this too, but we capture it too, which is a good, again, sanity check. And we can also see that in the vicinity of a reward region, we see some movement of the place fields. We see a crowding specifically of place fields at the rewarded location, which is something that's been reported for a while, and something other models have looked at that this model captures as well. One of the hippocampal things we capture that other ones don't capture so well is kind of a weird quirk of splitter cells, which are cells that form in hippocampus in partially observable environments. So if you have an alternating T maze like this, the animal basically runs in a figure 8. It runs down the central channel and turns right, and then it turns left, and then it turns right, and then it turns left. and so on. They get very good at this task. And what you see in the central channel, the place where the environment is technically partially observable, it depends on the history, these cells that split. At first, they just care about where you are in that channel. Later, they care about where you're coming from / where you are going. And this splitting has a particular pattern to it, where you see more splitting at the beginning and more splitting at the end, with relatively less in the middle. And we see that, we see that in our data as well, in a version of this model that we augment to have to be recurrent, so that it has some access to history so it can solve this task. The recurrence means that there's some carryover of the past, and the fact that it's trying to make a prediction will cause an increase in splitting, indicated by this line going down, compared to when we just have a model-free agent that doesn't have that factor. Interestingly, this task, while it seems like this splitting would be basically just a necessary state representation that you need to solve this task, you need to make a partially observable environment observable, the fact that splitting happens in hippocampus is a little odd, because once this task is learned, it's not actually hippocampally dependent anymore. So it doesn't seem like the state representation is necessary for doing the behavior, which is consistent, at least with this hypothesis, that maybe it's driving learning in other places, or it's helpful to learning, but not required once the animal's good at the task. We also looked at activity in our encoders, or in visual cortex. And here we wanted to simulate results from an experiment where a mouse, which is running along an environment in virtual reality, has two environments that it can see. One, an environment with vertical stripes on the walls, where it gets a little bit of reward at the end. One, an environment with angled stripes on the walls with no reward. And what you see during this experiment is very slight changes in the receptive fields in visual neurons in the mice that are trained on this task. And what you see specifically is a slight increase in the cells that are receptive for the rewarded environment. Basically, like, you see more cells that form receptivity to vertical stripes. And this is indicated, this same thing happens in our model too. You can see this from the increase from this gray plot to this, from this gray bar to this orange bar here. You see a bit of an increase, a larger increase than you see just in something that becomes familiar as the animal learns to do this task more. And you also see that this is drawing specifically from the neurons that have no measured preference, which is something that they see as well. Finally, the last visual effect we wanted to look at is this interesting feature of the effect of temporal learning on representations in IT, in a higher level visual area. And basically, this experiment was a way to see how temporal sequence effects would modify receptive fields in IT. So if you have stimuli like this, like a dog that is small and then bigger and then big, or images that are small elephant, medium elephant, big elephant, then the effect this has on neurons by default is that a neuron that fires for the small dog is likely to fire for the big dog too. There's some object-wise grouping to the neurons in IT. They seem to have a big role in identifying objects visually. If you train monkeys on swapped stimuli, so you start showing them sequences where little dog grows into medium dog, grows into large elephant, you start showing temporal statistics that are different from what you might see in the real world. And this has an effect on the representations in IT. So before this exposure, you can see the response of a neuron to these two stimuli looks like this. Afterwards, they start to move towards each other a little bit. And we see this a similar thing in our model as well. We set up a different version of this experiment with grid stimuli instead of specifically these visual objects to keep it consistent with the framework we were looking at before. But you see the same thing. If you pick stimuli that happen to randomly activate the same neuron, and then you start training on sequence statistics that disrupt this, you can change representations in the same way. And that makes some amount of sense. If you are trying to learn features that allow you to make predictions about the future, these temporal sequences will really disturb your representations. Cool. Okay. I think I'm probably moving through this slower than I wanted to, so I'm going to skip the details of the predictive. Actually, yeah, I'll go into it. Okay, so I mentioned before that the predictive auxiliary loss that I presented was an approximation. And in particular, it's a contrastive loss, which means we have this predictive term, which says make representations, make these latent representations such that you can predict future states based on them. But if we only have that term, then we end up getting a different kind of representational collapse where it's really easy to predict a latent state if it never changes. And so that's a good solution to arrive at. We don't want that. So we have an additional term, which is the negative sampling term, which basically says pick two random states that you have experienced at some point and make sure their representations are far away from each other. And in some sense, from a machine learning perspective, this feels a little bit like in some sense, a trivial loss. It's just saying like separate stuff as much as possible. From the neuroscience perspective, though, implementing this is actually like kind of interesting and tricky. You need to really like recall something that you're not immediately seeing, and then use that to push different representations apart. So one thing that we were thinking about is there's a lot of speculation about how different components of hippocampus might relate to pattern separation and pattern completion. Similarly, there's different kinds of sequence effects that have been measured in hippocampus. Things where you sample states in a sequence, things that are really nearby each other, and situations where you sample states that are really far away from each other. You get this very non-local replay. So this sort of starts to hint at a hypothesis that I think is really intriguing, that these different sampling modes are contributing to a different aspect of representation learning that's important for driving representations in hippocampus, but also the rest of the brain too. Cool. So takeaways from this part one. Is that an alarm? Great, okay. Takeaways from part one. Multi-objective models are useful for capturing some of the data we're seeing. We're seeing some similar effects emerging in deep RL models with predictive objectives, as well as different parts of the brain. I think from the perspective of thinking like, where are deep learning models particularly useful for showing us things about the brain? Things where toy models that might be more analytically tractable, more comprehensible, can't show us stuff. These phenomena about representation learning are a really nice thing to focus on. This is a point that's been made in other work as well, that like using models that have different objectives and relate them to different representations is a nice way to try to make sense of how representations in the brain relate to different computations. This also is a way of relating some existing hypotheses about what hippocampus is doing, that it has a role in making predictions about the future, to a different hypothesis or a really like complementary hypothesis that this is also serving a role in representation learning. Some limitations is we would like to have more lesion data to compare things to. The ideal test of this would be lesion hippocampus and then see changes not happen elsewhere in the brain as we hypothesize. Then the normal things about biological plausibility, comparison to baselines, things that we're doing now for a journal paper. There's also some limitations of predictive objectives in general. My favorite of them is that retrospective information also seems to be really useful. And this is something that I haven't really thought about a ton yet in the context of neuroscience, but I'm really excited to. Finally, I'll talk really briefly about this, some of the work that we're doing with deep learning to try and make efficient learned simulation. And so you'll recognize this figure. It happened in Kelsey's talk. And we're going to talk about something that relies on a really similar framework. We're still using graph neural networks for simulation. And we're going to make a tiny switch to see if we can make them more efficient. So the tiny switch is that we're going to replace our meshes with implicit representations called signed distance functions. And what signed distance functions are is a function that is used to describe some object. And what it takes in is some point in space. And what it returns is the signed distance to the surface of that object. So if it's outside of the object, it might have a positive sign. If it's inside the object, it'll have a negative sign. And it will have a gradient that points exactly towards the surface of the object. And it's a way of, it's a function, but it has in it information about the shape, information about where the surface is. So we're going to take these same graph network simulators, but in addition to having some of the mesh information, we're also going to use learned signed distance functions in order to compute some of the information about how objects relate to each other, what the distances from points on one object are to another. And for learned SDFs, it basically just means that we're going to, instead of computing the ground truth sign distance function, something that would require us to know the mesh and then compute the distance to the surface and figure out if we're inside or outside of the object, we're going to take that information, we're going to use it to train up a neural network that when queried with a point returns the distance to the surface. The advantage of these learned SDFs is that it has a lot of the benefits of SDFs. It can compactly represent the shape. The gradient points towards the surface. We can efficiently compute how far we are from the surface. But we can control the memory a little bit more because we can just say, here's the size of neural network you're allowed to use. Try to get a good sign distance function. So we can see this advantage in terms of memory here. As we increase the number of mesh nodes, or nodes in the mesh, you can see the size of the object increases. That's that line in blue. For the learned SDFs, which all have the same number of parameters in them, it stays constant. And so that means we've saved out the correct objects. This has some downsides because we are now forming an approximation of the object surface. And where you can see this, our model is in green here. And we're comparing to some other baselines, in particular FigNet and FigNet Star. FigNet is one of the models that Kelsey presented that has mesh-based simulation. And FigNet Star is an efficient variant of that that we've also put out. You can see FigNet and FigNet Star in particular have a bit better error, both in terms of translation error and rotation error. The error is lower. But where the SDF shines is that it's doing better in terms of memory and it's doing better in terms of runtime. So we're basically saying we're going to get worse performance. Hopefully it's not a lot worse. And we're going to get better memory and we're going to get better runtimes. Where this approach really shines is in simulating, doing just these like massive simulations. So these videos are very pretty. They recapitulate physically plausible dynamics. We have some analyses of looking at penetration error and other things to like calibrate plausibility. And you can see that they're getting a pretty decent job. Yeah, Toby also like just rendered some gorgeous videos for these. And an important point to make here is that these evaluations are vastly more objects than were ever seen in simulation. These are hundreds of objects, and we don't see more than 10, I think, that order of magnitude during training. So we have this advantage that Kelsey mentioned of when you have a relational system, you have this inductive bias, and this is a very powerful thing to have, which basically says, since we're learning local rules, since we're learning about interactions, when we have more objects, even though it's wildly out of distribution, we can pretend it's in distribution because the interactions themselves are in distribution. It's basically a way that breaks the problem into the right parts such that this out of distribution problem is an in distribution problem. Cool. Okay, so the takeaways for this part 2, which is the final part, implicit representations are useful for efficient simulations while preserving some of the advantages but trading off error. Graph-structured priors are really nice for permitting generalization to new compositions of the same local dynamics. The limitations, we have room for improvement on accuracy in particular. In this case, we need to know the objects ahead of time, although there's some work that's been developed by other people to learn a more general prior over sign distance functions. And in our case, dynamics are learned in simulation. So here we're imitating the dynamics of a physics simulator rather than learning these from data, although in principle you could do that thing. So for closing thoughts, I just want to wrap up by saying like the themes that I think kind of emerge from this, the things that I've been thinking about. One is that this relationship between representation and computation is really useful. It's been something I've been thinking about a lot in the context of neuroscience because we can measure representational geometry, and what we want to know is what's the computation happening in the brain. So the fact that deep learning casts computations as series of re-representations seems like a useful thing, and exactly how to make use of it is something I know the folks in this room have thought about a lot, and something that I've been trying to think about in new ways too. And the other is that local models are a really nice way to combine structure and expressiveness. It is injecting user knowledge into the system, but it's a powerful kind of information to inject because it allows you to train something on simple systems and generalize to more complex ones. So basically, if you know the right parts to break the system into, but you don't know exactly how to describe those parts, it's a nice way of combining expressiveness and structure. And one example that I really like of this is the parts of a espresso machine. They're not all super simple, but they're kind of like mostly comprehensible. Whereas you can kind of get a sense of, if you look at an espresso machine and try and figure out how it works, I have never gotten any intuition from that entire composition. But if you break it into these parts, you can start to think about how to design something more complicated. Another example in terms of how a model might break its own data into parts is this like very famous example of chain of thought reasoning, where if you just add the phrase, let's think step by step to a question, models get better results, which is like kind of slightly embarrassing. But there's a really nice paper from Christofsky et al. From Noah Goodman's group that was in Neuroscience this year that was basically hypothesizing that the reason this works is because it's taking a out of distribution question and forcing the model to break it into parts. And those parts are more likely to be familiar. You take this out of distribution problem, you break it down into in distribution steps. So in addition to those being simple or comprehensible or good on working memory, those parts are also in distribution. So that's a really handy thing to have. Okay, cool. I want to thank my collaborators, the folks at DeepMind who work on learned physics simulation. I've learned incredible amount from working with them. Qing Fang, who did the work on representation learning. She's awesome. And then collaborators and folks in my lab at Columbia. That's been like a really special experience. Thanks. Do I get to do my own? Cool. I think you were first.
So the predictive auxiliary laws, that was just kind of like learning a world model, like a predictive world model. Have you tried using a model-based RL agent? How would that perform? And like, what's really the point of having the model-free part of it?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So in some sense, the point is to say model-based learning has challenges associated with it. If you want to select actions by iterating out a model, it takes time. So what we were specifically looking at in this paper is there basically like a role that prediction serves that just is useful for guiding representation learning, and you don't even need to use the model for making predictions. This isn't really like an alternative. Like once you had a predictive model, you'd use it for predictions and like making forecasting what's going to happen. You could use that to guide action selection in a more model-based way. I think there's plenty of evidence that the brain does that humans and animals do that. But even without that part, just the act of learning to make predictions can make your model-free process, the part that's just acting quickly and presumably not taking into account these diverse predictions, perform a lot better and sort of implicitly take into account these predictions. So in our case, it wasn't to say like this is better, sort of just like, is there another hypothesis about what's this doing that gives us a different explanatory dimension? I wouldn't like it's not really model comparison and this works better than this other thing, or this thing works and that thing can't. It's more like these are different forces that are potentially moving representations around in the brain. Yeah.
Kind of related to that question, I guess in this whole idea of the successor representation also having something to do with hippocampal coding, it seems like in both your work, and in this case, yeah, it's somewhere between model-free and model-based, where the hippocampus is learning, state transitions and kind of, the kind of transitional properties of the world, but not necessarily the rewards. And it seems like, do you think this convergence of these two different lines of work really indicate that the hippocampus might be doing this kind of encoding the transitional properties instead of the rewards?
Good question. I guess I kind of think both are in hippocampus, and I also really think hippocampus is doing model-based stuff as well as potentially driving representation learning. This has a lot of conceptual overlap with the successor representation stuff from earlier, but in that model, it's like the successor representation serves as a compressed sequence model, a compressed model-based learning algorithm, and you learn value representations on top of it. Whereas here, this is forcing those representations to emerge upstream, and has more representational flexibility. Like the successor representation couldn't really move state representations around. So I guess reward information seems to be in hippocampus. There seems to be plenty of it. It's not totally clear exactly what role it's serving, but you do see cells that care about reward and move around with respect to it. My hypothesis is that it's potentially useful for the model-based part of making predictions, but I'm not totally sure.
Yeah.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on that too. Yeah, and then Blake and then Alex.
So I wonder whether you can see the predictive, like you call objective, as a form of also reward, right? Because if you can predict well, then you feel like on the well-being side, you're being rewarded.
Yeah.
But if the specific reward is also more global for well-being.
Yeah, I mean, so in this case, we just stick it into the objective. So presumably it's what the model or animal like wants to do, whether it's whether that's kind of treated subjectively as intrinsic motivation or something else. I think I don't have like strong claims about, but yeah, I think predicting things for its own sake is something that people like. My cousin is a first grade teacher, and she says predictability breeds trust. And so I think that's maybe a related idea. Blake and then Alex and then Dan, do we have time for that?
Yeah, let's do 3 really quick ones. I'm going to extend the break, so don't worry. I'll make this quick. I just wanted to add to your conversation with Louis there. I think that an interesting question is to what extent the hippocampus's replay and like generative mechanisms are used explicitly for model-based planning by the brain. I think it's kind of an open question. It seems like it could be, but I don't know that anyone, I don't know if you know of it, has shown convincing evidence that it is.
I don't think so. I think basically there is some evidence that it is consistent with model-based stuff. There is some evidence that it is doing other stuff too. I think one thing I liked about this project is that until talking with Ching about like basically trial and error to get the objective working, like I had not really thought of this other utility for replay, although maybe like, these are negative and positive sampling terms. This is a sampling process. Perhaps it should have occurred to me, but I did think like it was the first time maybe a super well-formed version of here's another hypothesis for replay at least happened in my brain. So yeah, I agree. Yeah, Alex and then Dan.
I was going to ask about the place cells creeping backwards. And by the way, amazing talk. I really enjoyed it. It seems like, yeah, you can recapitulate a lot of aspects of biology with these models, and now you can do it in a couple different ways, either with successor representations or these more complicated deep RL models. I'm wondering, like, if you've seen in instances when you've been able to explain the same biological finding by a few of these different models, is the overall interpretation for why it's happening similar for the successor representation in deep RL?
I think it's really similar in this case. I should say, like, the successor representation did an okay job modeling the skew, a bad job modeling the movement backwards. It had more activity near goal regions, but didn't have cells moving towards the goal regions. So there's like some things that this does just capture that the tabular successor representation like didn't capture well, or we could kind of squint and be like, well, if you assume there's some smoothing or whatever, then that's sort of similar, but this just captures it better. And Ching had another work that I wasn't involved in using RNNs to look at successor representations, and they also show similar movement towards goal regions and this like backward movement. Like when you free up when you allow more representation learning, you get it better. And I think this, because conceptually it's really similar, so I think it's like a similar interpretation. If it were a really different interpretation, then it would be like try to find some data that differentiates. But in this case, it is a pretty similar interpretation, at least on those tasks in particular, I think. Yeah, Dan?
Yeah, so that was great. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask, as somebody who sort of like dabbled in building particle-based, like learned models of physics, and this is sort of also a question for Kelsey together. It's like, so what's preventing, if anything, replacing like existing physics simulators that are kind of on the market with learned physics simulators? I mean, I remember years ago at a panel, Imo Turov said, oh, you never need anything learned. We can just build it, right? Like by hand, like we know the approximations to Newton's equations that we need. And of course, that was true in this very like per case environment. And so you had one simulator for like rigid things and one thing for, like deformable objects and one thing for hair and so forth. But it was actually really hard. There was nothing on the market that was like general. So it always seemed like to me the promise of the learned simulators was that, they could handle all the cases. Maybe they wouldn't be as physically perfect in every case, but they would be able to handle lots and lots of cases. is that true? And are we going to be able to replace, like in video games or in whatever, like the I don't know, PhysX or whatever, with a general purpose multi-material learn simulator? And if not, what's standing in the way of that?
I think, I mean, so in our, in a lot of our work, both the work I showed, the work Kelsey showed, the simulators are trained from simulators. And so the learn simulators are trained from simulated trajectories. So there's a bit of a, you need to have the physics simulator in order to get a learn simulator on those dynamics.
Like collapse multiple different simulators from different material types into like one learn simulator and then go from there or something? Or
yeah, potentially. Yeah, Kelsey, do you want to?
I'll pipe in and say, like, yes, absolutely. I think that that's one of the biggest promises. The major limitation at the moment actually is speed. So, like, within the solver setup I was showing with the airflow optimization, it's faster. But if you compare HiBullet to FigNet in terms of like per step simulation speed, the learned GraphNet models are like 10x slower. And so if you need something that's really, really fast, now there's promises of like, oh, maybe you could compensate for taking fewer steps or something because you can learn to like approximate bigger steps in time because you have neural networks instead of hard-coded functions. But that is the biggest limitation. It's not one of multi-material interactions.
so you think that would work, in other words?
I am almost 100% sure that would work.
This is like a counterpoint to the idea that having a simple equation allows you to generalize. In fact, maybe having the simple equation forces you to not generalize in the case of the physics simulation, and having something that learns allows you to generalize across material type.
Yes, I think so. I mean, we've done only some analyses of multi-materials, mostly sand and fluids and honey, like in the fluids case, but there it does generalize across, like it is able to interpolate things like viscosity,
Right. And
for
that,
example.
And that was certainly something we found in the earlier work, but it's like now we should be able to, with these newer things, replace the old stuff and do better.
Yeah, we can talk at the conference.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's talk more about that at the coffee break. So we're going to do a half an hour coffee break. I think everyone needs it. So we'll be back at 3:30. So 3:30, and let's thank Kim again.